The music, the costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
For nearly 40 years, the four faces of ABBA seemed frozen in time. Four young Swedes in glittering costumes, smiling beneath the lights as if nothing in the world could ever separate them. But time did exactly that. Agnetha Fältskog, Björn Ulvaeus, Benny Andersson, and Anni-Frid Lyngstad went on to live remarkably different lives. Yet the strangest part is what happened next. So, how do ABBA members compare from then to now in 2026? This is a story of how four people who once seemed inseparable survived heartbreak, fame, tragedy, and nearly 4 decades apart, and what came afterwards. To make sense of it all, we need to start from the very beginning. Four lives collide in Sweden. Today, ABBA can feel almost impossible to separate from the music itself. The voices are still everywhere, the songs still fill stadiums, films and dance floors, and yet the four people behind that sound are now in their 70s and 80s, living lives that have little resemblance to the glittering world they once occupied together. There was a time, however, when Björn Ulvaeus, Benny Andersson, Agnetha Fältskog, and Anni-Frid Lyngstad were just 4 Swedish musicians whose paths happened to cross. It all started in June 1966, when Björn Ulvaeus met Benny Andersson. Björn was already a member of the hugely popular Hootenanny Singers, while Benny was the keyboard player for the Hep Stars, one of Sweden's biggest pop groups. They immediately discovered that they could write together, and within weeks they had created their first song, beginning a partnership that would eventually produce some of the most recognizable melodies in popular music. But at this point, neither man was planning to create ABBA. Then, in 1969, everything changed. Björn met Agnetha Fältskog, who was already a successful solo singer after releasing her first single in 1967. Benny, meanwhile, met Anni-Frid Lyngstad, known as Frida, a Norwegian-born singer who had moved to Sweden as a child and was already building her own recording career. The remarkable part was that the musical partnership was developing alongside 2 romances. Björn and Agnetha eventually married in July 1971, while Benny and Frida married in October 1978. Before ABBA conquered the world, its 4 members were already becoming 2 couples. But the first attempt to turn those 4 talents into a group was almost a disaster. In 1970, they created a cabaret act called Festfolk, a deliberately cheeky name with 2 meanings: party people and engaged couples. The idea seemed logical, but the reality was brutal. When Festfolk opened in Gothenburg in November, the venue was practically empty. Agnetha later remembered seeing only scattered couples sitting at the tables, while Björn described the experience as the absolute low point of their careers. After the failure, the idea of working together as a quartet was effectively shelved. That failure may have been exactly what saved them. Instead of forcing themselves onto a stage, Björn and Benny began concentrating on songwriting and production, while Agnetha and Frida continued their own careers. The 4 would eventually discover that the studio was where their combination truly worked. In spring 1972, they recorded People Need Love. They weren't even ABBA yet. The record was credited to Björn and Benny, Agnetha, and Anni-Frid. But it became a respectable Swedish hit and gave the 4 musicians evidence that their voices could work as a single unit. The following year, they entered Sweden's Eurovision selection with Ring Ring. They finished 3rd, but the song and album became major Swedish successes and began attracting attention beyond the country. There was still one problem. They needed a name. The cumbersome Björn and Benny, Agnetha and Anni-Frid was hardly ideal for conquering the world. Their manager, songwriter and record company boss Stig Andersson eventually proposed ABBA, formed from the first letters of their names. But there was an absurd complication. ABBA was already the name of a Swedish canned fish company. The musicians needed permission to use it, and the company agreed, provided the pop group did not do anything that would reflect badly on the fish business. By 1974, the 4 were finally ready to gamble everything on Eurovision again. And that is where the real ABBA story begins. The night everything changed. By April 6, 1974, ABBA had already failed once on the road to becoming a real group. Now they were standing on the Eurovision stage in Brighton, England, dressed in flamboyant 70s costumes and preparing to perform Waterloo, a song built around Napoleon's defeat but designed to sound like nothing else in the contest. When the votes came in, Sweden had its first Eurovision victory, and ABBA suddenly had an international audience. Waterloo went to #1 across much of Europe and even reached the American top 10. For 4 young Swedes, it looked like the dream had arrived in a single night. But the victory came with a hidden trap. Eurovision could make you famous overnight, but it could also make the music industry dismiss you just as quickly. That is almost exactly what happened. After Waterloo, ABBA struggled to convince Britain and other major markets that they were more than a flamboyant Eurovision novelty. Their follow-up releases failed to reproduce the breakthrough, and the group suddenly found itself fighting the reputation that should have been its greatest advantage. Björn Ulvaeus later recalled that people in the music industry seemed to assume ABBA would be a one-hit wonder. It took roughly 18 months before another major international breakthrough arrived with SOS. The rescue came partly from the other side of the world. Australia had become unusually fascinated with ABBA, helped by television broadcasts of the group's promotional films. When Australian audiences embraced SOS and Mamma Mia, the group's record company pushed harder in other territories. Mamma Mia became a #1 hit in Britain and spent 10 weeks at #1 in Australia. ABBA's own history describes what followed as a kind of Australian ABBA fever. They eventually collected 6 Australian #1s, and Björn later said Australians had effectively rescued the band when much of the international industry was ready to write them off. Then came the song that changed their status permanently. Dancing Queen was recorded during sessions that began in August of 1975, with Björn and Benny experimenting with disco and drawing inspiration from George McRae's Rock Your Baby. The track took months to complete, with overdubs continuing into December. Even before it was released, Frida heard an early backing track at home and was so overwhelmed by it that she began to cry. When Dancing Queen finally appeared in August of 1976, it became a worldwide #1 and eventually gave ABBA their only American #1. The song's effortless happiness concealed an astonishing amount of studio work. Layers of vocals, instruments, rhythm tracks, and painstaking production had been assembled until the record sounded just perfect.
Björn Ulvaeus has been winning hearts of ABBA fans worldwide through his performances with the group and is best known for his wonderful composition of music that threw the band to the heights of its fame.
By then, ABBA was no longer simply successful. It was becoming an industrial-scale operation. The members were expected to record constantly while also promoting their albums, appearing on television, traveling internationally, and maintaining the image of 4 glamorous friends who seemed to be having the time of their lives. The reality was more complicated. During the period when Arrival was being made, the group was simultaneously dealing with promotional commitments, solo projects, and production work for other polar music artists. Even their touring schedule had to be arranged around Björn and Agnetha's family life and their young daughter. The machinery that produced those apparently effortless pop songs was beginning to consume enormous amounts of time and energy. And nowhere was that machinery more overwhelming than Australia. When ABBA arrived there in 1977, the reception was extraordinary. Fans crowded streets, media surrounded the group almost constantly, and thousands turned out simply to see them arrive. At one Sydney concert, roughly 25,000 people endured heavy rain for hours waiting for ABBA. The group eventually made the Australian tour the basis for ABBA, the movie, capturing both the hysteria and the exhausting reality behind it. Agnetha later described the Australian experience as the most incredible thing she had experienced with ABBA. But the group's official history also records that the fan hysteria stayed with her long afterward. Then the hits kept coming. Fernando, Money, 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 Knowing Me, Knowing You, The Name of the Game, and Take a Chance on Me. By 1977, ABBA had become one of the biggest groups on Earth, but the success carried a strange contradiction. The songs sounded increasingly bright, polished, and euphoric, while the lives of the people singing them were becoming more complicated. Knowing Me, Knowing You, for example, would later be remembered as one of ABBA's great breakup songs, even though it was written and recorded before either of the band's 2 marriages had ended. Behind the sequins were 2 marriages, 2 children, a relentless touring schedule, and 4 personalities coping differently with unprecedented fame. The public saw Dancing Queen. The people inside ABBA were living something much messier. And as the 1970s approached their final years, could these four people who created the phenomenon survive each other? 2 marriages, 2 breakups. By the time the 1970s were coming to an end, ABBA had reached a strange point in its history. The 4 people who had built the group were no longer simply bandmates. 2 of them were married couples, and both marriages were beginning to crack under the pressure of fame. Björn Ulvaeus and Agnetha Fältskog had married in 1971 and had 2 children, but by late 1978 they had decided to separate. Their divorce was finalized in July 1980. What made the situation extraordinary was that neither wanted the collapse of the marriage to destroy the group. They agreed to keep working together, even as the private relationship between them disappeared. Agnetha later said they had simply drifted apart and that they might have separated even if they had never been pop stars, and the timing could hardly have been more awkward. ABBA was still operating at extraordinary commercial strength. In 1979, the group released Voulez-Vous, toured Canada, the United States, and Europe, and continued producing hit after hit, while Björn and Agnetha were dealing with the aftermath of their separation. Then came the song that would make their private pain part of pop history. The Winner Takes It All was released in July 1980, shortly after their divorce had been finalized. Björn wrote the lyrics, Benny wrote the music, and Agnetha sang them. To anyone listening, the song sounded almost brutally specific. A relationship had ended, one person appeared to have lost, and the other seemed to walk away victorious. Yet Björn rejected the idea that it was a literal account of their marriage. He described it as fiction based on the experience of divorce and insisted that there had been no winner or loser in his own relationship with Agnetha. Agnetha's own later explanation makes the story even more complicated. In a 2013 interview, she acknowledged that the song could certainly be connected to their divorce, but said it was not necessarily entirely about their personal experience. She suggested it could contain elements from both Björn and herself. What she did not deny was the emotional cost of recording it. She said the period was tragic for both of them and described singing the song as one of the strongest recording experiences of her career because they were both still deeply affected by what had happened. The remarkable fact, then, is not that Björn supposedly wrote a secret confession about his ex-wife. It is that 2 people who had just ended their marriage were capable of turning that emotional wreckage into music. And not just any music, a #1 record. The first divorce had not stopped ABBA, but the second one would test them even further. Benny Andersson and Anni-Frid Lyngstad had been together since 1969 and married in October 1978, right at the height of ABBA's fame. By February 1981, they announced that they were separating, and their divorce followed later that year.
The same year Lyngstad and Andersson married, Fältskog and Ulvaeus announced their divorce. Lyngstad and Andersson's marriage didn't last long either, and by 1981 they had also announced their divorce.
Suddenly, the group's carefully constructed image of 2 glamorous couples had completely disappeared. Yet there was no immediate collapse. ABBA went straight back into the studio. When recording began on The Visitors in March 1981, only weeks had passed since Benny and Frida had announced their separation. The 4 were no longer 2 couples working together. They were 4 colleagues who respected one another professionally but were increasingly distant outside the studio. The music itself began reflecting that atmosphere. The Visitors, released in November 1981, was strikingly darker than the glittering ABBA of Dancing Queen. Its songs dealt with separation, uncertainty, loneliness, and fear. When All Is Said and Done was particularly revealing. Björn wrote the lyrics about the emotional aftermath of a broken relationship, while Frida provided the voice. One of Us went even further, with its story of one partner crying while the other lies alone in bed. ABBA's official history describes The Visitors as an album made while the group was confronting both their marital splits and the possibility of life beyond ABBA. Then came an almost surreal final phase. In 1982, Frida began work on her first English-language solo album, Something's Going On, produced by Phil Collins. Björn and Benny were increasingly focused on developing chess, while Agnetha and Frida were reviving their solo careers. The group still made music together, but the energy was disappearing. Their final singles, The Day Before You Came and Under Attack, were sophisticated and haunting, but neither achieved the worldwide impact ABBA had become accustomed to. And then, almost quietly, ABBA stopped, going their separate ways. When ABBA stopped working together in 1982, the four members, no longer tied as couples, scattered into four very different lives. Björn Ulvaeus and Benny Andersson remained inseparable creatively, turning away from pop stardom and toward ambitious musical theater. Their first major post-ABBA project was Chess, created with lyricist Tim Rice. The concept album arrived in 1984, and 2 years later the stage production opened in London's West End. One Night in Bangkok became an international hit, while I Know Him So Well reached #1 in Britain. The two men who had built ABBA's sound were proving that their partnership had never depended entirely on the four-person group. Agnetha Fältskog's path went almost in the opposite direction. She continued recording after ABBA, but the larger her fame became, the more she seemed to want distance from it. Her fear of flying had already become severe after ABBA's private aircraft encountered violent weather while approaching Boston in 1979. She subsequently preferred traveling by road whenever possible. And in early October 1983, shortly after Agnetha had been in London promoting her solo album, Wrap Your Arms Around Me. Because her fear of flying had become severe after ABBA's frightening flight to Boston in 1979, she was traveling by road. On the journey home through southern Sweden, the tour bus overturned after the driver lost control. Agnetha was lying down at the back of the bus when the crash happened. She later recalled that she instinctively curled herself into a ball to protect her head and face, but she was thrown through a side window and landed in a ditch. She briefly lost consciousness. She was taken to hospital and treated for shock, cuts, and bruises. She was not seriously injured, but the psychological impact was considerable. About 2 weeks later, she appeared on the Swedish television program Måndagsbörsen to promote her music, even though she admitted that she had not fully recovered. She told journalists that she still had neck pain and headaches, felt unwell, and remained shocked by what had happened. There was also an ugly media controversy immediately afterward. A Swedish tabloid published claims suggesting that Agnetha was pregnant and had somehow concealed it. She publicly denied the story, and her record company Polar Music began legal action for alleged slander. Agnetha said she was exhausted by having her private life constantly turned into speculation and emphasized that she wanted to discuss her work, not have journalists invent stories about her personal life. By the end of the 1980s, she withdrew from music and public appearances. Her retreat became even more understandable after a devastating sequence of personal events. Agnetha's mother unalived herself in 1994, and her father died the following year. Then came a relationship that would eventually become a frightening, stalking ordeal. Agnetha began dating Dutchman Gert van der Graaf in 1997, but after she ended the relationship in 1999, he continued pursuing her. A Swedish court imposed a restraining order, and he was deported to the Netherlands in 2000. He later returned to Sweden and was arrested again in 2003. Frida Lyngstad's life after ABBA took an even darker turn. Her childhood had already been extraordinary. Born in Norway on November 15, 1945, to Norwegian mother Sinni Lyngstad and German soldier Alfred Hasse, she belonged to a generation of children whose families were caught up in the aftermath of Nazi occupation. Her mother died when Frida was only 2, and her grandmother took her to Sweden, where she was raised. Decades later, after ABBA had become famous, Frida discovered that the father she had believed was dead had actually survived the war. After ABBA, Frida achieved international success with her solo albums Something's Going On in 1982 and Shine in 1984. But her life soon moved far beyond music. In 1992, she married Heinrich Russo-Reuss von Plauen, a German prince and landscape architect, and moved deeper into European high society. Then, in 1998, tragedy struck with almost unimaginable timing. Her daughter, Anne-Lise Lotte Fredriksson, died at the age of 30 after a car accident in Livonia, New York. The following year, Frida's husband died from lymphoma at only 49. Frida later described losing her daughter in 1998 and her husband in 1999 as two overwhelming blows that forced her to find some way of surviving the grief. Meanwhile, a different kind of crisis was unfolding around the ABBA fortune. Their manager and business architect, Stig Andersson, had helped transform 4 Swedish performers into a global business empire through Polar music. But the relationship eventually deteriorated badly. In 1990, companies connected to Agnetha, Benny, and Björn sued over alleged underpayment of royalties. The disputed amount was as high as $27 million. The case was settled out of court in 1991, but the terms were never publicly disclosed. Björn himself later found his own enormous financial dispute in the crosshairs of Swedish authorities. In 2006, the Swedish tax agency claimed he owed approximately 87 million kronor in taxes, fees, and interest, arguing that royalty income had been routed through foreign companies and financial structures. The allegations became serious enough that contemporary reports used terms such as tax evasion and money laundering. But the crucial ending is often lost in the sensational headlines. In October 2008, Stockholm's County Administrative Court ruled entirely in Björn's favor and ordered that 85 million kronor in disputed tax be returned to him. The court rejected the tax agency's reasoning. And yet, while the 4 people were moving further apart, something remarkable was happening to ABBA itself. The group was becoming bigger without producing new music. ABBA Gold turned their catalog into a permanent commercial force, while the Mamma Mia musical introduced the songs to audiences who had never experienced ABBA in its original era. By the time the 4 members were living almost completely separate lives, the group had stopped being merely a band from the 1970s. It had become a cultural institution, and that created the central paradox that would haunt the next chapter. The more determined the 4 became to leave ABBA behind, the harder the world found it to let ABBA go. The strange afterlife of ABBA. By the 1990s, ABBA had become more famous without performing than most groups were while touring. The turning point came in 1992 when ABBA Gold Greatest Hits was released and began a second life for music that had originally belonged to another generation. The compilation eventually became one of the most successful greatest hits albums ever released, spending hundreds of weeks on the British charts. By August 2019, it had passed 900 weeks in the United Kingdom's top 100. But ABBA Gold was only the beginning. The revival gathered speed through some unlikely places, including 2 Australian films released in the 1990s. Muriel's Wedding used ABBA songs as part of its story, while The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, helped turn the group's music into something associated with camp, liberation, and a younger generation. The songs were no longer simply reminders of the 1970s. They were being rediscovered by people who had never lived through ABBA's original peak. According to Björn and Benny, children who had grown up hearing ABBA without caring about whether the group was considered cool eventually became adults who simply loved the music. Then came the move that changed everything. In 1999, London's Prince Edward Theatre hosted the premiere of Mamma Mia, a musical built entirely around ABBA's songs. The unusual part was that the songs were not being presented as a biography of ABBA. Instead, writer Katherine Johnson constructed a completely separate story around them, allowing tracks such as Dancing Queen, Take a Chance on Me, and The Winner Takes It All to become part of a new narrative. That distinction mattered enormously. ABBA's music no longer needed ABBA. The 4 original members could stay away from the stage while actors around the world performed their songs to new audiences. The musical eventually became a global phenomenon, and its success helped transform ABBA from a successful old band into a permanent piece of popular culture. A younger generation was discovering the group through theater, films, and cover versions rather than through old television appearances. That is what makes the famous billion-dollar story so intriguing. In 2000, reports emerged that an American-British consortium had offered ABBA an enormous sum to reunite for a major tour. $1 billion, connected to a proposed 100-concert schedule. They said no. Björn later explained that 100 concerts, television appearances, sponsorship commitments, and the entire machinery surrounding such a tour would have consumed an enormous part of his life. He feared audiences would expect to see the ABBA of the 1970s rather than four older people returning decades later. In another interview, he said the group had even considered whether a reunion for charity might justify itself, but ultimately concluded that they simply did not have the artistic motivation. The decision was unanimous. Even when the offer was increased to $2 billion, Björn still said no. In 2008, Björn was blunt. They would never appear on stage again because there was no motivation to regroup. And this wasn't merely stubbornness. Their original relationships had changed. Their lives had moved on, and they had spent decades protecting the ending they had created. A conventional reunion would mean confronting not only the passage of time, but also the enormous expectations attached to the word ABBA. By then, the group had something rare, a legacy that could remain frozen at its peak. Then, in 2016, someone approached them with an idea that could solve the problem. ABBA comes back without coming back. British entertainment entrepreneur Simon Fuller approached ABBA with an idea that seemed to solve the problem that had kept them apart for decades. They could perform again without actually having to tour. The plan was to create digital versions of Agnetha Fältskog, Björn Ulvaeus, Benny Andersson and Anni-Frid Lyngstad, allowing younger versions of the four to appear on stage while the real members remained off the road. That opportunity quickly led them somewhere nobody had expected. Once the four reunited in the studio to record music for the digital project, they discovered that they still enjoyed working together. In 2018, ABBA announced that they had recorded new music together for the first time in roughly 4 decades. The result was Voyage, released on November 5, 2021, almost exactly 40 years after The Visitors. The numbers alone made the comeback extraordinary. The four members returned to Benny's Stockholm studio, Riksmixningsverket, over a period of roughly 4 years and recorded 10 new songs. 2 of them, I Still Have Faith in You and Don't Shut Me Down, became the emotional foundation of the comeback. ABBA's official history makes clear that this was not simply a producer assembling old recordings or a modern artist sampling their catalog. Björn and Benny wrote and produced the material, while Agnetha and Frida returned to provide the voices. They were, for the first time in decades, genuinely making new ABBA music together. But the strangest part was still waiting. ABBA had spent decades refusing to return to the stage. Yet now, they had found a way to perform without actually requiring their present-day bodies to do it.
Benny, Björn, Agnetha and Anni-Frid will be represented on stage. The avatars will be a perfect digital recreation of ABBA from the 1970s.
The project used motion capture technology to create digital versions of the four members as they appeared in their younger years. Those digital ABBA figures would perform alongside a live 10-piece band inside a purpose-built arena in London. The concept was bizarre enough that even the group described it as weird and wonderful. Benny explained that audiences would essentially be watching their digital selves, while the real members could sit somewhere else and watch the show themselves. It was not quite a reunion tour, not quite a hologram concert, and certainly not a traditional comeback. It was something ABBA had never attempted before. By 2022, ABBA had achieved something almost impossible. They returned without truly returning. Voyage became a worldwide success, while digital versions of their younger selves performed nightly in London, allowing the real Agnetha, Björn, Benny, and Frida to remain outside the spotlight. Then, in 2024, all four stood together again at Stockholm's Royal Palace to receive Sweden's Royal Order of Vasa, decades after their marriages, divorces, tragedies, and disappearance from the stage. Their story had come full circle. They had spent nearly 40 years refusing to reunite, only to return on their own terms. Not as the young stars frozen in those glittering 1970s photographs, but as four people who had survived everything that came afterward. ABBA could not stop time, but they found a way to preserve what time could not destroy: the music, the memories, and the image of four people who once changed pop music forever. And perhaps that is the strangest ending of all. The real ABBA grew old, but the ABBA the world fell in love with never had to. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.